Hi, this is Matt Baker. Today I'm starting a new series in which I'll be discussing various hypotheses about the historical Jesus, or in some cases, the not-so-historical Jesus. You see, one of the things that has puzzled scholars for a long time is the fact that we have very few sources outside of the New Testament that mention him by name. We do have a few, but you'd think that if he was as popular and remarkable as the Bible says he was, for example, drawing crowds of up to 5,000 people and regularly performing miracles, you'd think that we'd have more evidence for his existence. Well, this problem is usually solved in either one of two ways. The standard explanation, and the one held by the vast majority of secular historians, is that Jesus was simply not as noteworthy during his lifetime as you might think. You see, the mainstream view is that Jesus was just one of many apocalyptic preachers that were around in first century Judea, warning people that they better shape up because the end of the world was coming soon and God was about to establish a kingdom on earth. Another possibility, held by a small minority of scholars, is that Jesus simply did not exist at all, and that he was instead a myth developed by early Christians. Well, there is actually a third possibility, and that is that Jesus, his family, and his followers were in fact mentioned in other sources, but under different names. In other words, maybe Jesus wasn't Jesus' real name, or at least not his original name. Therefore, if we instead look for a similar story in other sources rather than for the exact name, maybe we can find him. Well, that's what several amateur sleuths have done, so in the first few episodes of this series, I'll be exploring several of the possibilities they came up with. I'm going to start with a hypothesis which claims that Jesus was a secret grandson of Herod. Personally, it's not the hypothesis that I think is the most likely to be true, but it's definitely the one that I most want to be true, because it's basically the equivalent of a good old Useful Charts Who Would Be King episode. It was developed by a lawyer named Joseph Raymond and presented in his book, The Herodian Messiah, Case for Jesus as Grandson of Herod. But before I jump into it, I want to make it clear to you that this series is going to be dealing with a lot of controversial ideas, which is why I specifically asked Ground News to sponsor this video. You see, Ground News is a website and app that allows you to examine thousands of news topics from a variety of different angles. For every breaking story, they combine coverage from multiple sources so that you can compare reporting from across the political spectrum and the world. For example, they recently gathered over 100 articles about a church that created an AI Jesus. By the way, you can follow along at home by scanning the QR code on screen or by clicking the link in the description below. Sources on the left focused on how the project allowed people to ask Jesus questions, whereas sources on the right focus more on how AI Jesus was able to provide comfort. So obviously, depending on what sources you read, you can end up having a totally different perspective, which is why Ground News is so, useful. They even have useful charts. I love how their app uses charts like these ones to show additional data on each news source, such as whether they lean to one side politically and even where they get their funding from. It even highlights what isn't being widely covered on the blind spot feed. Thus, it can help you have more productive conversations with family and friends on contentious topics. So, in a world that is constantly changing, Ground News is a tool that we all need. You can check it out now by going to ground.news/charts or by using the link in the description or pinned comment. Subscribe through my channel this month and you will save 40% off unlimited access to their Vantage plan. Okay, back to hypothesis number 1. Jesus was a secret grandson of Herod. In order to explain why this hypothesis is a possibility, I first need to give you some genealogical information relating to the time period in which Jesus lived. To do this, I'm going to be using my biblical family tree chart, which, like all of our charts, is available from our website, usefulcharts.com. You're probably familiar with the Maccabees, who are the heroes of the Hanukkah story. They led a revolt against the Greeks who had desecrated the Jewish temple. After their victory, the Maccabees were able to rededicate the temple and set up an independent Jewish kingdom, which historians refer to as the Hasmonean kingdom, Hasmonean being the official family name of the Maccabees. Several generations of Hasmoneans ruled this kingdom, serving as both high priests and monarchs, until the 60s BCE, when there was a civil war between two brothers, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II. At this point, the Romans stepped in and helped put an end to the conflict, but in the process, they also took control of Judea and made it a client state of Rome. Initially, they allowed the Hasmoneans to stay on as monarchs, but when the Hasmonean king Antigonus II betrayed them, allying instead with the Parthians, the Romans sent a general named Herod to reconquer Judea, which he did. At this point, Antigonus II was taken to Rome and beheaded by none other than Mark Antony, and in his place, Herod was instead made king of the Jews, becoming known as Herod the Great. Initially, the high priesthood was passed to Antigonus II's nephew, Aristobulus III, but soon thereafter it became an appointed position instead. Thus, the Hasmonean dynasty came to an end. Or did it? Next, I want to introduce you to Herod's family. This chart only shows 3 of his sons, because it is these 3 who are most important to the biblical story. Archelaus, because he became ruler of Judea after his father's death. Antipas, because he became ruler of Galilee, which is where Jesus was from. And Aristobulus IV, because he was the father of the later king, Herod Agrippa. Note that Aristobulus IV was given a Hasmonean name because his mother was a Hasmonean princess, being the sister of the last Hasmonean high priest, Aristobulus III. Finally, take note that between the reigns of Herod Archelaus and Herod Agrippa I, there was a period of about 35 years when there was no Herodian ruler in Judea, and instead the area was ruled directly by Roman governors, such as Pontius Pilate. But here's the thing. Herod actually had several more sons. For example, Aristobulus IV had an older full brother named Alexander. The 2 of them were his second and third-born sons. And then there was his fourth-born, Herod II, who was the son of Herod the Great's third wife. But the most important missing son is his firstborn, Antipater, who was the son of Herod's first wife, Doris. The reason why he's not included on the poster is that he died before Herod, and thus is not mentioned in the Bible. Now, if you know anything about Herod, it's probably that he was super crazy and loved killing people, even children. For example, when Herod became king, he made sure to kill almost all of the remaining Hasmoneans, even the babies, so that he wouldn't have any rivals, which is likely what inspired the massacre of the innocents legend found in the Gospels. According to Josephus, Herod allowed only 5 Hasmoneans to escape the initial purge. Mariamne, whom he married, but then later killed, Mariamne's brother, Aristobulus III, who he later killed, Mariamne's mother, Alexandra, who he later killed, Mariamne's grandfather, Hyrcanus II, who he later killed, and finally, an unnamed daughter of Antigonus II, who, as far as we know, he did not kill. We're going to come back to her. Now, lest you think that Herod only liked to kill other people's children, I have to inform you that he killed several of his own as well. For example, near the end of his life in 7 BCE, he became convinced that Alexander and Aristobulus IV were plotting to kill him, so he had them both executed on charges of treason. Then, in 4 BC, just a few months before he himself died, he became convinced that his firstborn son Antipater was going to kill him. So he had him executed too. On top of this, Herod II's mother was claimed to be in on the plot. So Herod II was removed from the line of succession, even though his life was spared. This meant that Archelaus, Herod's 5th-born son, was now his primary heir, which is why Archelaus ended up inheriting Judea after Herod's death, as mentioned in Matthew chapter 2, verse 22. But this is where things get interesting. What if Antipater had a secret son? If he did, that individual would have had an excellent claim to the throne. To find out if this was even possible, we first have to find out whether or not Antipater had any wives. Well, according to Josephus, he had two. One was a daughter of Aristobulus IV, but the other, very interestingly, was that unnamed Hasmonean princess that I mentioned earlier. Remember, she was the daughter of the very last Hasmonean king, and as far as we know, by 4 BCE, she would have been the last remaining Hasmonean to still be alive. Which brings up the question, why was she allowed to survive? Well, probably because Herod wanted his firstborn son Antipater to have a Hasmonean wife, like he initially did, in order to better cement their dynasty's claim to power. Although, of course, we know that in the end, Herod ended up killing Antipater. But there's no record of him killing Antipater's wife or any of their children. Presumably, they didn't have any. But what if Antipater's wife was pregnant in 4 BCE? And what if the baby was born after both Antipater and Herod the Great died? That child would have had a double claim to the throne, as both the senior-most grandson of Herod the Great and the only male descendant of the last Hasmonean king. Okay, by this point, I think you already know where I'm going. What if Jesus, who was also born in 4 BCE, was this hypothetical baby? And what if Mary was Antipater's widow, the last member of the Hasmonean dynasty? Several of the details fit, especially the timing. Also the fact that Mary was a single woman, pregnant with a fatherless baby, who ended up marrying someone who was not the father of the baby. On top of this, we know that Mary, Joseph, and the baby ended up fleeing to Egypt, specifically to escape the wrath of Herod the Great, and that when they returned home after Herod's death, they opted to hide out in Galilee after hearing that Archelaus had been made ruler. Think about it. It's actually much easier to believe that Jesus must have been some sort of special baby that Herod wanted dead for political reasons than to believe that he was a miracle child born of a virgin. However, all of these aligning details are not actually the primary foundation upon which Joseph Raymond developed his hypothesis. His main line of evidence is actually based on Jesus' genealogy, as given in the Gospel of Luke. According to most scholars, the Gospel of Matthew provides us with Jesus' legal ancestry through his adopted father Joseph, whereas the Gospel of Luke provides us with his biological ancestry through his mother Mary. So let's now look at the names of Mary's ancestors given in Luke, in particular the last 7 names prior to Mary's generation. Interestingly, the second to last name is Mathat, which is short for Mattathias, or in English, Matthew. Well, what do you know? The Hebrew name of Antigonus II was none other than Matthew. Above him, we get Levi and Melchi. Well, Melchi is simply the Hebrew name for king, and Levi is another word for priest. So perhaps these two names were actually inserted as a kind of secret code, indicating that Jesus descended from the Hasmoneans, who were the only family in all of Jewish history to serve as both kings and priests. Next, above Melchi, we get Janai, which is short for Janneus, an extremely rare Jewish name. In fact, the only known Janneus in this entire period was, are you ready for it? The Hasmonean king, Alexander Janneus, grandfather of Antigonus II. Finally, we get one more very important Hasmonean name, another Mattathias. You see, if we keep going back from Alexander Janneus, we eventually come to Mattathias, the father of the Maccabees, and the initial leader of the Maccabean revolt. But what about Joseph and Heli? Well, Raymond doesn't really offer an explanation for Joseph, except to say that that name and all the rest above Mattathias were probably just filler. However, for Heli, he suggests that this individual was perhaps the adopted father of Mary, who took care of her after Antigonus II was killed. After all, she was likely a baby at the time, and therefore her adopted father would have played a major role in her life. As an aside, take note that Catholic tradition says that Mary's father was a priest named Joachim, which actually fits because an alternative name for Joachim was Eliakim, or for short, Heli. Also, it makes sense that an orphaned Hasmonean princess would have been put in the care of a high-ranking priestly family, considering that the Hasmoneans had been not only royalty, but also priests. Speaking of names, there are a few ancient sources that mention that Jesus' real father was a Roman soldier named Pantera. Interestingly, Pantera sounds an awful lot like Antipater, and Antipater was known to have served in the Roman army during his many years living in Rome. Probably a coincidence, but a kind of tantalizing one. Okay, the final thing that fits with this hypothesis is the trial and execution of Jesus. He is first brought before the Jewish authorities, who try to charge him with breaking basic religious rules and with claiming to be the Messiah. However, next, when he is brought before the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, Pilate asks him just one thing. And this one question is recorded in all four Gospels. Pilate looks at Jesus and asks, "Are you the king of the Jews?" That is pretty direct and pretty specific. Not really something you'd ask of a simple troublemaker, unless they actually did have a legitimate claim to the title. Now, remember, according to the biblical account, the Jewish authorities hadn't said anything about him claiming to be an actual king. They charged him with claiming to be the Messiah. To a modern Christian mind, the difference between Messiah and earthly king is a big one, but to a first century Jewish mind, it was not. You see, in Hebrew, the word Messiah, or Mashiach, literally means the anointed one, and was exclusively used in an earthly sense for individuals who were or would be anointed as either king or priest. So for Pilate to go from Messiah to king was not actually much of a leap. Okay, so that's the hypothesis. In many ways, it makes a lot of sense. However, if you're familiar with the New Testament, you will have noticed at least one major flaw. In Scripture, Jesus is quite clearly expected to be a descendant of King David, not of the Herodians or Hasmoneans. So how does Joseph Raymond, the main proponent of the hypothesis, deal with this problem? Well, he offers two potential solutions. One is the suggestion that Jesus was a descendant of David through Antipater's mother, Doris. Doris was Herod's first wife, and the only one to be, like Herod himself, an Idumean, or Edomite. You see, Edom was a kingdom south of Judea, and Doris was a member of that kingdom's royal family, which may have intermarried with Judahite royalty way back when the House of David dynasty was in power. The second possible solution is that while the people expected the Messiah to be from the Davidic line, Jesus himself hinted that he was not, perhaps because he felt that being a combined king-priest from the Hasmonean family was even better. There's a rarely discussed passage that shows up in all three synoptic Gospels, which is the only time that Jesus himself addresses the idea that the Messiah had to be from the line of David. In Mark's version, Jesus says, "How can the scribes say that the Messiah is the son of David? David himself, by the Holy Spirit, declared, 'The Lord,' meaning the Messiah, 'said to my Lord,' meaning David, 'Sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet.' David himself calls him, the Messiah, Lord. So how can he, the Messiah, be his, David's, son?" All right, so that's the hypothesis. The first of many that we will be exploring. Not as a way to prove that Jesus wasn't God, or to prove exactly who he was, but to simply dive into the whole topic of the historical Jesus in a fun way, while learning more about first century Judea in the process. So what do you think of this first hypothesis? On a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being BS and 10 being, oh my God, that's gotta be true, how would you rank this particular idea? Let me know in the comments. Next time we'll be exploring a hypothesis that I personally think carries a bit more weight. It's the one posited by Lena Einhorn, and it involves the idea that the main events in Jesus' life actually occurred about 20 years after we think they did, because the gospel writers purposely shifted the story a few decades earlier. So keep an eye out for that. Thanks for watching.